Hello, everybody, and welcome to How California Works. I'm Chris Nicholson. I recently wrote an article for California Local about how to protect your community from wildfire by working with your neighbors to create and maintain defensible spaces. Today, we're going to pay a visit to the cabin my family built and where we've been working for years to make our land more pleasant and wildfire resilient. So come along as I check in on how it's going and make a list of things we still need to work on. I'm a California native and have been visiting Yosemite and the Yosemite area my whole life, starting in the early 60s with my father and brothers, and then later with my own family. And so now my family and my children have come to love this part of the high foothills just a few miles from the mountains of the Sierra. About 20 years ago, we were driving by on our way to Yosemite and saw a for sale sign on this place for several acres of raw land and called the realtor as soon as we got back home. From the road driving by, we could see it rose up and had a tall hill, which must have had a hell of a view, and though it was a stretch, we bought it literally sight unseen. I say sight unseen because the property we had purchased had been burned to the ground in a forest fire in 1989, and years later was now covered with 8 and 10-foot tall manzanita and some pines and oaks poking out. It took us a year of coming up weekends and holidays to cut a trail to the top of the hill through the manzanita. One morning, I carried a step ladder up the trail we carved and set it up in a little clear patch and climbed up above the rest of the 10-foot tall manzanita on the hilltop and caught my first view of our view. Wow, it was so magnificent, just snow-capped mountains receding in the distance. And it inspired us to step up our efforts. After a couple of years of visiting and a whole lot of effort, we cleared a much larger space on the hill down the trail up to the top. It was so much effort. It was going so slowly. So I finally called a local fellow with the bulldozer. And one day he cleared the remaining manzanita off the top of the hill and down the backside. He pushed it all into a few tall piles, very tall, house size, and set them on fire, and they burned for a couple of days. The next step after that was to build the driveway up the top of the hill from the road, which took months of getting permits and all of that. And after the driveway came the well, and then came the septic tank, and finally the cabin. A year after the cabin, we built the garage, and then a couple of years after that, the little one-room studio behind the cabin. So the defensible spaces we need to clear and maintain are the spaces around the structures we built so they won't catch fire from flying embers and burn down in a wildfire. Defensible space consists of 3 concentric zones surrounding structures which are vulnerable to wildfire. The goal is to reduce vegetation and flammable materials in those zones to create a safer space for firefighters to work. Zone 0, also known as the home ignition zone, is the structure and a space extending 0 to 5 feet away from it. In this zone, you want to make sure that you screen all vents and plug all gaps to prevent sparks and embers from entering the structure. You want to keep rain gutters free of debris, remove piles of flammable material, and you want to keep the landscaping clear around the structure. Zone 1 is the area of 5 to 30 feet surrounding a structure. Here you want the ground cover to be 4 inches tall or less. You want to remove lower tree branches. You don't want any trees within 10 feet of structures. And you want a clearance of 18 feet between tree crowns. And finally, you want to make sure to remove piles of dead grass or dead branches or things like that. Zone 2 is the area of 30 to 100 feet surrounding a structure. Here you want to make sure that trees are spaced with a clearance of 12 feet between crowns. And again, you want to remove the lower tree branches, you want to remove dead trees or shrubs, and you want to remove accumulated ground litter. So let's do a survey of the defensible zones around our cabin, our garage, and our studio as they stand right now. Right off the bat, this pine tree is a huge problem. It overhangs the cabin and produces an enormous amount of annual pine needles that are flammable and will be blown up against the cabin and burn in event of a wildfire. Otherwise, there's a 5-foot wide cement walkway around the cabin, but I still need to take a weed whacker to the grass between the structures and around the structures just to cut it down below 4 inches. Here you can see that this hose is acting as a debris trap, so that needs to be cleared out periodically along with the grain gutters and other debris traps. The water heater shed is a problem. The screens don't protect it from embers and sparks. The door is warped, so that needs to go and be replaced. The garage. Don't stack firewood against structures. That's a flammable debris pile in zone 0, so that needs to be relocated. And then you'll note that this soffit has warped and deformed over the years and pulled away and has a opening in which sparks and embers can enter, so that needs to be fixed. Here is my favorite oak tree on the property. I love it. I'm not going to cut it down. I am going to trim the lower branches, and it will provide much needed shade for the studio in the summer, so it needs to stay. On the other hand, the 3 pine trees that are located very close together and overhang the garage are probably going to be cut down, most certainly going to be cut down, and they need to go. Here's the studio. Once the pine trees to the left are cut down and the grass weed whacked, it should be okay in terms of zone 0 and zone 1, although this stump, which is a little coffee table, is one of those debris accumulation traps, plus it's flammable itself, so it probably needs to go. This pine tree that's growing behind the studio needs to go. So there's the gravel driveway in front of everything. You can see that that just needs some weed whacking and that'll be okay. The hill that slopes down on the other side of the garage is filled with a lot of trees that still need to have their lower branches removed. And here I am down here in the summer. I use a pole saw to remove the dead lower branches. And you can see that the trees here are very thick. This is beyond Zone 2. This is a little more than 100 feet down the hill from the garage, but because the trees are growing so close together, it's not really what you would call a healthy forest. And so, in addition to making the land more wildfire resilient, there's also just the land stewardship aspect of making the forest healthier. But that's the price you pay when you have land in the wildland-urban interface. You buy it, you cherish it, you work it, and you protect it.